There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday evening, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a conversation about nothing in particular. You don't recognize them as watershed events when they happen. There is no fanfare, no sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure. It is only later, when you trace the map of your own heart, that you find the precise coordinate where the entire landscape of your world tilted on its axis. For me, that moment smelled faintly of takeout Thai food and the lavender fabric softener Liam liked to use, and it was cloaked in a discussion about whether we should finally go hiking next Saturday. It was the most normal, unassuming moment imaginable, right up until the second it wasn't. We were on the couch, the same way we were most nights. The television was a murmur of blue and gray light in the corner, playing some documentary about deep-sea life that neither of us was actually watching. The city outside our third-floor window was a distant, watercolor smear of traffic and noise, a world away from the quiet continent of our living room. Liam was sprawled on his end, long legs stretched out, propped up on a cushion. I was on mine, curled into the corner, a book lying open and forgotten on my lap. The space between us was a familiar territory, a neutral ground measured in inches of worn upholstery and shared history. It was a space I had learned to navigate with the careful precision of a cartographer mapping a treacherous coast, always aware of the currents beneath the surface, always careful not to run aground on the sharp rocks of what I actually felt. He was talking, his voice a low, tired rumble that was becoming more and more his default setting lately. I just think if we're going to go, we should go early. Beat the crowds, you know? Like 7 a.m. early, he sighed, a sound of pure, bone-deep exhaustion. God, I don't even know if I can handle 7 a.m. on a Saturday. I smiled, a small, reflexive thing. We don't have to. We could just not. He turned his head to look at me, and the ambient light from the television caught in his eyes. For a few seconds, he just looked. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning. His expression was something I couldn't decipher, a language I hadn't yet learned. This was the space I lived in, the constant, silent translation of Liam. Every glance, every gesture, every shift in his breathing was a piece of data I would collect and analyze late at night, trying to assemble it into a truth I was too cowardly to ask for outright. My heart did its usual, stupid gymnastics, a frantic thumping against my ribs that I was sure he could hear across the 3 feet of couch cushion separating us. Then he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to stretch time until it was thin and translucent. He shifted his weight, leaning across that carefully maintained neutral ground. My entire nervous system went on high alert, every sensor firing at once. His hand came up, and for a wild, illogical second, I thought he was going to touch my face. My breath caught somewhere in my throat, a painful, sharp thing. But he was just reaching for the remote on the end table beside me. Of course he was. I let the breath out in a slow, silent stream, chiding myself for the surge of ridiculous, unrequited hope. He was just getting the remote. That's all it was. But he didn't pull back. He picked up the remote, his fingers closing around the worn plastic, and then he paused. His arm was still extended, his body still angled toward me, and the little space that separated us had shrunk to almost nothing. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the way a few strands of his dark hair had fallen across his forehead. And he was still looking at me with that unreadable expression. The deep-sea documentary murmured on, the narrator's voice talking about the crushing pressure at the bottom of the ocean. It felt appropriate. "You have some hair in your eyes," he said. His voice was different, quieter, softer. And then he did it. He lifted his other hand, the one not holding the remote, and he brushed my hair back from my forehead. It was the lightest touch, the barest whisper of his fingertips against my skin, but it landed on me with the force of a physical blow. It was a sunburst behind my closed eyelids, a silent detonation in the center of my chest. His fingers were warm and a little calloused from the climbing gym he sometimes went to. They lingered for a fraction of a second too long, a pause that contained an entire universe of unspoken questions. And then he smiled. It wasn't his usual big, easy grin. It was small and tired and hesitant, and it was the most devastatingly beautiful thing I had ever seen. The world stopped. The documentary, the traffic, the refrigerator hum, it all fell away into a profound, ringing silence. There was only the feeling of his fingers against my skin, and the look in his eyes, and the quiet, terrifying question that bloomed in the space between us. We had just been talking about weekend plans. And now, I had no idea what we were talking about at all. To understand the seismic impact of that single, simple gesture, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. You have to understand the architecture of our friendship, the load-bearing walls of unspoken rules, and the carefully constructed boundaries I had spent years reinforcing. Liam and I were a study in comfortable orbits. We had circled each other for 6 years, ever since we'd been randomly assigned as suitemates in our freshman year of college. He was the outgoing one, the one who collected friends like other people collected stamps, the one who seemed to move through the world with an effortless, sun-drenched confidence. I was the quiet observer, the one who saw the world through the viewfinder of a camera, more comfortable documenting life than participating in it. We were an unlikely pairing, a Venn diagram with what should have been only a sliver of overlap. Yet somehow, the space we shared became the place where we both made the most sense. I fell in love with him in increments, in a series of quiet, unannounced moments that accumulated like dust motes in a sunbeam until they formed something solid and undeniable. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic fall. It was a slow, gentle descent. It was the time he stayed up with me all night in our sophomore year, making endless cups of terrible instant coffee while I frantically finished a final photography portfolio, not saying much, just sitting there, a steady, grounding presence in my panic. It was the way he'd always bring me back a specific brand of dark chocolate from the grocery store without me ever having to ask. A small, silent acknowledgement that he was paying attention. It was watching him from across a crowded party, seeing him laugh, that full-throated, head-thrown-back laugh, and feeling a pang in my chest so sharp and specific it was like a form of homesickness. He was, in every conceivable way, my best friend. He was the first person I told when I got my first paid photography gig. He was the one who dragged me out of my apartment for a week after my grandmother passed away, not trying to cheer me up, but just making sure I ate, making sure I saw the sun. Our lives were intertwined in 1,000 different threads, from the shared utility bills and the ridiculous amount of his running shoes by the front door, to the easy, shorthand language we'd developed over the years. I knew that the specific way he sighed meant he'd had a bad day with a client. He knew that if I was cleaning my camera lenses, it meant I was feeling anxious and needed to do something methodical with my hands. And through all of it, I kept my feelings locked away in a room deep inside myself. The door to that room was heavy, soundproof, and bolted from the inside. I was the sole guardian of that secret because I understood, with a painful, crystalline clarity, that our friendship was a delicate, perfectly balanced ecosystem. My feelings were an invasive species, a foreign element that, if introduced, would destroy everything. Liam was straight. He'd had a serious girlfriend, Sarah, for most of college. I had been there through their entire relationship, a friendly, supportive fixture in the background. I'd listened to him talk about her, celebrated their anniversaries with them, and even helped him move her things out of his apartment after their amicable, sad breakup a year ago. I had played my part so well, for so long, that I sometimes wondered if the role had consumed the man. I was Leo, Liam's best friend and roommate. That was my truth, the one I presented to the world. The other truth, the one that lived in the locked room, was that I was hopelessly, quietly, and completely in love with him. The risk of telling him was annihilation. It wasn't just about rejection. It was about the potential devastation of the most important relationship in my life. I would lose the easy camaraderie, the late-night talks, the comfortable silences. I would lose my home. And so, I chose silence. I chose to be the quiet observer, to live on the periphery of my own heart, cherishing the platonic intimacy we had because it was infinitely better than the nothing I would be left with if I ever dared to ask for more. Our apartment was a testament to our dynamic. His side of the living room was a controlled chaos of tech gadgets, fitness magazines, and the occasional stray sock. My side was neat, almost monastic, with stacks of photography books arranged by size and a collection of old film cameras on a shelf. Yet, our lives bled into each other's spaces. My camera bag was often dropped near his work backpack by the door. His favorite coffee mug was almost always on my side of the sink. We had built a life in that apartment, a shared world that felt safe and contained. It was a haven, and I was its self-appointed, vigilant protector, always on guard against the one thing that could bring it all down, myself. I had accepted my lot. I would love him in silence, and I would be grateful for the friendship he gave me so freely, so unconsciously. It was a bittersweet arrangement, but it was stable. It was known. I could survive the quiet ache. I was not sure I could survive the alternative. This was the foundation. This was the intricate, fragile structure that he threatened to collapse with nothing more than a gentle touch and a hesitant smile. The shift began subtly, so much so that at first, I wrote it off as a temporary anomaly, a statistical blip in the data of our lives. It started about 3 months before the night on the couch. Liam's job, a high-pressure consulting gig that had once seemed to energize him, began to consume him. The change was like the slow turning of a season, a gradual leaching of color from the landscape of his personality. He had always been a source of kinetic energy, a whirlwind of plans and social engagements. Our apartment was often a revolving door of his friends, the air filled with laughter and the sounds of a life being lived at full volume. But slowly, the whirlwind began to dissipate. He started coming home later, the confident stride he usually had replaced by a weary shuffle. He'd drop his bag by the door with a heavy thud that seemed to echo the weight he was carrying on his shoulders. The easy smile was still there, but it didn't always reach his eyes anymore. I'd see him standing in the kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator without really seeing anything, his shoulders slumped, the sharp lines of his jaw tight, with a tension he never spoke about. He stopped making plans on the weekends. The constant stream of texts and calls from his wide circle of friends seemed to dwindle, or maybe he just stopped answering them. Our apartment, once a hub of activity, grew quiet. The silence was vast and unnerving. At first, I tried to address it directly. "Tough week," I'd ask, trying to keep my voice casual, a friendly roommate making conversation. He would just nod, offering a vague, one-word answer. "Yeah," or "just busy." He was building a wall, not an aggressive, confrontational one, but a passive one made of exhaustion and deflection. He didn't want to talk about it, and I, ever the cautious cartographer of his moods, knew better than to push. It felt like watching a vibrant, thriving plant begin to wilt, and I was powerless to do anything but watch, unable to offer the water it so clearly needed because I didn't know the source of the drought. The real change, the one that started to gently blur the carefully drawn lines between us, was in how he began to occupy our shared space. He had always been restless, unable to sit still for long. But now, he started to seek out stillness. More specifically, he started to seek out my stillness. I work from home mostly, editing photos at my desk in a corner of the living room. It's my quiet zone. Previously, Liam would come home, say a quick hello, and retreat to his room to decompress. But now, he started to linger. He would come home, change out of his work clothes, and then, instead of disappearing, he would just settle. He'd take a spot on the couch, not turning on the television, not picking up his phone, just sitting there in the quiet while I worked. The first few times it happened, it was deeply unsettling. His presence was a tangible thing, a weight in the room that pulled at my focus. I was acutely aware of every breath he took, every small shift of his body on the cushions. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, convinced he was watching me, judging my work, my posture, my very existence. But when I'd risk a glance over at him, his eyes would be closed, or he'd be staring blankly at the wall, his expression slack with fatigue. He wasn't watching me. He was just there. He was using my quiet as a shield, my presence as a form of ambient, undemanding company. He started to gravitate towards me, closing the physical distance in our apartment in a way he never had before. If I was making dinner in the kitchen, he would come and lean against the counter, scrolling aimlessly on his phone, not speaking, just sharing the small space. If I was reading on the armchair, he'd take the end of the couch nearest to me. It was a slow, unconscious migration, a pulling into my orbit that felt both deeply comforting and incredibly dangerous. My locked room of feelings began to rattle. A tremor went through the foundations. The hope I had worked so hard to starve was beginning to find a new source of nourishment in these small, ambiguous gestures. I told myself it meant nothing. He was stressed. He was burned out. He was lonely after his breakup with Sarah, a loneliness that was probably being amplified by his work stress. He was seeking comfort from his closest friend. It was platonic. It had to be. I repeated these phrases to myself like a mantra, a desperate incantation to ward off the catastrophic possibility of misinterpretation. But a small, treacherous part of me began to wonder. It was a tiny, fragile green shoot of a question pushing its way up through the concrete of my carefully constructed defenses. What if it wasn't just platonic? What if this exhaustion was stripping away his pretense, too, revealing something underneath that he himself didn't even recognize yet? It was a foolish, reckless thought, and I tried to crush it every time it appeared. But it was persistent, and it was starting to grow. The ritual began on a Tuesday. It was raining outside, a miserable, persistent drizzle that blurred the city lights into a Monet painting of melancholy. Liam had come home looking worse than I had ever seen him. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. He skipped dinner, mumbled something about a brutal client call, and collapsed onto the couch. I was at my desk, trying to finish editing a set of portraits, but the sound of his ragged, weary breathing was a constant distraction. After an hour of listening to him sigh and shift restlessly, I gave up on work. "Want to watch a movie?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He just grunted in what I took to be assent. I put on some mindless action movie, something with lots of explosions and very little plot, the kind of film that requires nothing from its audience. I dimmed the lights and settled into my usual corner of the couch. For a while, we watched in silence. Then, about 20 minutes in, I noticed his head had started to droop. His blinks were getting longer, slower. And then, his head tilted to the side and came to rest, very gently, on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every muscle locked. I stopped breathing. It was as if my whole world had suddenly shrunk to that single point of contact. The surprising weight of his head, the warmth of it seeping through the fabric of my t-shirt, the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My mind, which was usually a torrent of analysis and overthinking, went completely blank. There was only the feeling. It was terrifying. It was exquisite. I sat there, perfectly still, for the entire 2-hour movie, my arm going numb, my neck starting to cramp. I was a statue, a stone sentinel guarding this fragile, unbelievable moment. When the credits rolled, bathing the room in a soft white light, I dared to look down at him. He was fast asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful in a way I hadn't seen it in months. His lips were slightly parted, and a soft, barely audible snore escaped them. My heart ached with a tenderness so fierce it felt like a physical pain. I didn't know what to do. Waking him felt like a transgression, like shattering something precious. But letting him sleep there all night felt like crossing a line I wasn't prepared to cross. Eventually, I chose the coward's path. I gently shifted my weight, just enough to jostle him. His eyes fluttered open, hazy with sleep. He looked at me, then seemed to realize where his head was. A flicker of something, embarrassment, confusion, crossed his face before he quickly sat up, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Must have drifted off." "Long day, it's fine," I said, my own voice strained. "You were exhausted." He nodded, stood up, stretched, and shuffled off to his bedroom without another word. I sat on the couch for a long time after he left, my shoulders still tingling with a phantom warmth. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a fluke born of extreme fatigue. He was just tired. He didn't mean anything by it. But then it happened again 2 nights later, and again the following week. It became our new normal, our unspoken ritual. We would put on a movie or a show, and at some point, inevitably, he would fall asleep, and his head would find its way to my shoulder. Each time, my body would have the same initial reaction: the sudden tension, the caught breath, the frantic thumping of my heart. But as the ritual repeated, a new layer was added to my response. A slow, tentative acceptance began to creep in. I started to relax into it, to let the weight of his head feel less like a terrifying privilege and more like a comfort. I learned the rhythm of his breathing as he slept. I learned that he sometimes twitched in his dreams. I learned that the spot on my shoulder where his head rested would stay warm for a long time after he got up and went to bed. The ritual escalated. One night, the autumn chill had seeped into our drafty apartment. I saw him shiver in his sleep as he leaned against me. On impulse, I reached for the thick woolen blanket we kept folded on the back of the armchair. With painstaking slowness, I unfolded it and draped it over him. He stirred, a low murmur escaping his lips, and then he settled deeper into my side, unconsciously seeking the warmth. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I had crossed a new, invisible line. I had gone from passive participant to active caretaker. The next time we sat down to watch something, he didn't wait for me to offer. As he settled onto the couch, he reached for the blanket himself, unfolded it, and draped it over both of us, creating a small, warm tent of shared space. He had accepted my gesture and reciprocated it, making it part of the ritual. This became the landscape of my life. These long, quiet evenings spent in the half-darkness, sharing a blanket, with his head on my shoulder. My internal world was a raging storm of hope and fear. I would sit there, staring at the flickering screen, my mind dissecting every detail. The plausible deniability was my only anchor. He was tired. He was cold. He was seeking comfort from a friend. Any friend would do this. But the other side of my brain, the hopeful, traitorous side, would whisper back, "He doesn't do this with anyone else. He cancels plans with his other friends, but he never misses this. He seeks you out. He chooses this." The nightly ritual was both a sanctuary and a torture chamber. It was a beautiful, agonizing limbo where I was granted a taste of the intimacy I craved, but was forbidden from ever naming it, from ever asking if it was real. I was living in the space between a gesture and its meaning, terrified of collapsing that space, because if I was wrong, I would lose everything. And so I said nothing. I sat in the warm, quiet dark, and I let him sleep. And so we arrived back at the beginning, on that specific Tuesday evening, the one that smelled of takeout and lavender. The ritual was in full effect. We were on the couch, under the shared blanket, though he wasn't asleep yet. We were in that comfortable, liminal space between the end of the day and the beginning of the night. The documentary about fish that live in eternal darkness was playing, a fitting soundtrack for the depths I was constantly navigating within myself. The conversation about hiking plans was the most ordinary thing in the world, a simple piece of driftwood for me to cling to in the vast ocean of what was happening between us. It was safe. It was normal. When he leaned across me for the remote, my body tensed with the familiar, practiced anticipation. It was the muscle memory of hope. I expected him to retreat, to settle back into his spot, for the moment to pass as it always did. But the pause changed the chemical composition of the air. When he stayed there, suspended in the space between us, the ordinary moment fractured, and something new, something charged and uncertain, began to leak through the cracks. My entire consciousness was focused on his proximity, the sheer physical fact of him being so close. I could see the individual threads in his gray t-shirt, the tiny scar above his eyebrow from a childhood fall he'd told me about once. The world narrowed to these details. "You have some hair in your eyes," he said. His voice was a whisper, as if he were afraid of startling a wild creature. And perhaps he was. Perhaps he was afraid of startling me, or himself. Then his hand came up, and the touch, when it finally happened, was both a shock and an inevitability. It felt like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place, the final note of a song I had been waiting my whole life to hear. It wasn't like the accidental brushes of hands when we reached for the same thing in the kitchen, or the incidental contact of sitting close together. This was different. This was intentional. His fingers were so gentle, so careful, as they smoothed the hair back from my temple. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected tenderness that it bypassed all my defenses, all the walls and locked doors, and struck me right in the core of my being. It was an answer to a question I had never dared to ask. And he didn't pull away. His fingers lingered, resting against my skin, and in that lingering touch, years of silent yearning seemed to coalesce. I looked into his eyes, and the exhaustion was still there, but it was joined by something else now. Something vulnerable and open and deeply, terrifyingly sincere. He smiled that small, hesitant smile, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. It undid me completely. All the analysis, all the overthinking, all the fear that had been my constant companions for years, they all just dissolved. There was no more room for them. There was only him. There was only this. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything we had never said. It was the most articulate, eloquent silence I had ever experienced. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid he would hear it. I wanted him to. I wanted him to hear everything. He finally drew his hand back, and the loss of contact was a physical ache. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a flicker of the same fear I had been living with for so long. He was on the edge of the same cliff I was. He swallowed, his throat moving. "Leo," he began, and my own name sounded foreign and new on his lips. Can I ask you something stupid?" My voice was a thread, a whisper I wasn't sure I had actually managed to produce. "Anything." He took a breath, a shaky, uncertain thing. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his gaze unwavering. The courage it must have taken him to hold that gaze, I could only imagine. It was the courage I had never been able to find. "Would it be okay," he said, each word chosen with infinite care, "if I kissed you?" It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a move. It was a question, a plea for permission. It was an offering of his own vulnerability, a gesture of profound respect for the friendship he was risking in that very moment. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me all the power. And in that moment, I knew that all my fear, all my careful preservation of our friendship had been based on a false premise. I had been trying to protect it from a truth that was already there, living in the quiet spaces between us, waiting patiently to be acknowledged. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. That was all he needed. He leaned in, closing the final inch between us, and his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of passion or fire. It was a kiss of quiet confession. It was tentative and soft and breathtakingly gentle. It was the taste of salt and uncertainty and a hope so deep it was almost painful. It was his exhaustion and my yearning. It was 6 years of unspoken affection, of quiet observation, of friendship and love, all tangled up together. It was the sound of a locked door finally swinging open. In the blue light of a nature documentary, with the world humming along outside, completely unaware, my entire universe was being remade. And it was quiet, and it was slow, and it was happening right here, on our couch. The aftermath of a seismic event is never as dramatic as the event itself. It's the quiet, unnerving stillness that follows, the eerie silence where a familiar landscape used to be. The world after that kiss was a foreign country. When we finally broke apart, neither of us spoke. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed together in the half-darkness, the shared blanket a warm cocoon around us. Eventually, he whispered a quiet, "good night," his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name, and retreated to his room. I was left alone on the couch in the echoing silence, my lips still tingling, my mind a blank slate, wiped clean by the sheer, stunning reality of what had just happened. For the first time in years, I didn't analyze. I just felt. And what I felt was a fragile, terrifying, incandescent hope. I woke up the next morning on the couch, a crick in my neck and the woolen blanket tangled around my legs. I had fallen asleep right there, too overwhelmed to move. The sun was streaming through the windows, and the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. I sat up, my heart beginning a low, anxious thrum. Liam's door was closed. He was an early riser, always up before me for a run or to get a head start on work. The silence felt wrong. I got up and went to the kitchen to make coffee, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were afraid a sudden noise would shatter the delicate new reality. As the coffee maker gurgled to life, I saw a note on the counter. His handwriting was a familiar, sharp script. Had to go in early for a meeting. See you tonight. My stomach dropped. There was no Liam at the end. No smiley face he sometimes drew. It was abrupt, clinical. The fragile hope from the night before began to curdle into a cold, heavy dread. He was running. He was regretting. I had imagined it all, the tenderness, the vulnerability. I had superimposed my own feelings onto his exhaustion, and he had been too tired to push me away. The kiss had been a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment, and now the cold light of day had brought with it the harsh, stinging clarity of regret. My own. His. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I had destroyed everything. The one thing I had sworn to protect, our friendship, I had shattered it for a moment of impossible bliss. The day was one of the longest of my life. I tried to work, but the photographs on my screen were just meaningless arrangements of pixels. I couldn't focus. My mind was a looping replay of the kiss, of the look in his eyes, of the note on the counter. I swung wildly between the memory of his gentleness and the stark reality of his absence. Every creak of the building, every siren in the distance, made me jump, thinking it was him coming home early to deliver the final, fatal blow. The "we need to talk" conversation that would officially end our friendship and sever the foundations of my life. He didn't come home until late, well after 10. I heard his keys in the lock, and my entire body tensed. I was sitting on the couch, our couch, in the dark, unable to bring myself to turn on the lights. He stepped inside, and for a moment he just stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the hallway light. "Leo?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Hey," I managed to say. My voice was rusty. He flicked on the light, and we both blinked in the sudden brightness. He looked terrible, worse than before. His face was drawn and pale, and he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on a spot on the floor somewhere to my left. The easy camaraderie that had defined our existence in this apartment was gone. In its place was a thick, suffocating awkwardness. It was a physical presence in the room, a third entity sitting between us on the couch. "Long day," he said, the words sounding hollow. He didn't move to take off his coat. "Yeah," I said. The silence that followed was excruciating. It wasn't the comfortable, companionable silence we used to share. This was a dead silence, heavy with unspoken words and jagged with regret. He finally moved, shrugging off his coat and hanging it up. He went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and just stood there, the same way he had been doing for months. But this time it felt different. It felt like he was hiding. He was putting the physical barrier of the kitchen island between us. This went on for 3 days. 3 days of stilted, one-word conversations. 3 days of him leaving early and coming home late. 3 days of him avoiding my eyes. Of him retreating to his room the moment he got home. The couch remained empty in the evenings. The television stayed off. The blanket lay folded and cold on the armchair. Our apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a prison, each of us confined to our separate cells, the silence between us a thick, impenetrable wall. The pain was a constant, physical thing, a dull ache in my chest that wouldn't go away. It was the agony of having been given a glimpse of heaven, only to have the door slammed shut in my face. The worst part was the self-blame. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. I had taken his moment of vulnerability and twisted it into something it wasn't. I had ruined my friendship with the best person I had ever known. On the 4th night, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was going to drive me insane. I would rather have the brutal, painful truth than this agonizing, soul-crushing limbo. I knew he was in his room. I could see the sliver of light under his door. I walked to that door, my heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I felt like I was walking to my own execution. I raised my hand to knock, and my hand was shaking. I took a deep breath and knocked. 2 soft raps. The light under the door went out. My heart shattered. He was pretending not to be there, He was actively, consciously hiding from me. I stood there for a full minute, humiliation and hurt washing over me in a cold wave. I almost turned around. I almost went back to my room and accepted this new, broken reality. But then, a surge of something else, anger, maybe, or just sheer desperation, rose up in me. I was not going to let him destroy us with his fear. I had been afraid for 6 years. It was his turn now. Liam, I said, my voice low but clear, directed at the closed door. I'm not leaving until you talk to me. We don't have to talk about it. But you can't just pretend I don't exist. You can't do that to me. To us, there was a long silence from inside the room. I could hear him breathing. Then, the sound of movement. The lock clicked. The door opened a few inches. He was standing there in the dark, just a shape. Leo, I can't, he whispered, and his voice was broken. It was filled with a raw, ragged misery that cut through my anger and went straight to my heart. You can't what? I asked, my own voice softening. You can't look at me? You can't be in the same room as me. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I messed everything up, and that was it. That was the opening. He wasn't blaming me. He was blaming himself. I pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. His room was dark except for the glow of the city lights through his window. He was standing by his desk, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Tell me what you messed up, I said softly. Because from where I was standing, nothing was messed up at all. He finally looked at me, and in the dim light, I could see that his eyes were wet. I shouldn't have done that, he said, his voice barely audible. It wasn't fair to you. I'm so confused, Leo. I feel like I'm losing my mind. This job, and Sarah, and everything is just, it's too much. And you were just there, you were so calm. You're always the calm in the middle of all my chaos. I started to need it. To need you, he took a shaky breath. I spent so long telling myself that it was just friendship, that I was just tired. But then, that night, sitting there, I looked at you, and it all just hit me at once. It wasn't just about being tired. It wasn't just about needing a friend. It was more. And it terrified me, because I don't know what it is. I don't know what I'm doing. And I kissed you, and it was the only thing that's made sense in months. And that scared me even more. He finally confessed the truth of his retreat. So I ran, he whispered, looking down at the floor in shame. I woke up the next morning, and I panicked. What if I was wrong? What if I was just lonely, and I was using you? What if I hurt you? Hurting you is the one thing I don't think I could live with. So I thought if I just put some distance between us, I could figure it out. I could get my head straight. But it just made it worse. The silence, it's been killing me. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a foot away from him. The air was thick with his confession, with his fear and his confusion. And all my hurt, all my anger, it all evaporated, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of his own feelings. He was doing what I had done for years, running from the truth because he was afraid of the consequences. Did you misunderstand? I asked him, echoing the question that had been haunting me for days. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and shining in the dark. No, he said, his voice firm for the first time. I didn't misunderstand anything. I just got scared, me too, I said. I've been scared for 6 years. His eyes widened even more, a dawning comprehension on his face. The final piece clicked into place for him. He finally, truly, understood. Oh, he breathed out, a sound of wonder and regret. Leo. Oh. And then he was closing the space between us, his hands coming up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking my cheeks. I'm so sorry, he whispered again. But this time it wasn't an apology for the kiss. It was an apology for the silence, for the fear, for all the lost time. And then he kissed me again. And this time, there was no hesitation. There was no tentativeness. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was the feeling of two people who had been lost in the wilderness for a very long time, finally finding their way home. The new foundation was built not on grand pronouncements or dramatic declarations, but on small, quiet acts of intention. The tense, suffocating silence that had filled our apartment was replaced by a different kind of quiet, a peaceful, breathable silence, rich with understanding. We started talking, really talking, for the first time. He told me about the crushing weight of his job, the feeling of being an imposter, the loneliness that had settled in his bones after his relationship with Sarah ended, a loneliness he hadn't even known how to name. I told him about the years of quiet affection, about the room inside me where I had kept my feelings locked away, about the terror and hope I'd felt during our nightly couch rituals. We laid our truths out between us, fragile and precious, and we found that they fit together perfectly. The couch ritual returned, but it was transformed. It was no longer a space of agonizing ambiguity. Now, when he settled in beside me and reached for the blanket, it was a deliberate choice. When his head came to rest on my shoulder, it was not a gesture of unconscious comfort-seeking, but a conscious act of love. I could finally relax into it completely, my own hand finding his under the blanket, our fingers lacing together. There was no more fear, no more frantic internal analysis. There was only a profound sense of peace, a feeling of rightness that settled deep in my soul. I was no longer just the observer. I was a participant. This was my life, and it was more beautiful than any photograph I could ever hope to take. The domestic intimacy that had always existed between us as friends deepened and softened into something new. One Saturday morning, a few weeks later, I was in the kitchen, grinding coffee beans, the rich, dark smell filling the air. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dancing dust motes, the same way it always had. But everything felt different. I heard him pad into the room behind me, and then I felt his arms slide around my waist, his chin coming to rest on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just held me, his warmth seeping into my back, his steady breathing a quiet rhythm against my ear. I leaned back into his embrace, closing my eyes, and I felt a sense of peace so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was it. This was the new normal. It was the easy, unspoken comfort of a shared morning, the simple, profound joy of being held by the person who was my home. The door to that room inside me was no longer locked. It was wide open, and the light was pouring in. In the end, you realize that the most significant moments are rarely the loudest ones. They are not the declarations shouted from rooftops or the grand, cinematic gestures. They are the whispers. They are the quiet shifts in a familiar landscape, the hesitant questions asked in the half-dark, the gentle touch that recalibrates your entire world. Our love story wasn't a sudden fire. It was a slow, patient dawn, a gradual illumination of a truth that had been there all along, waiting in the shadows. We had to navigate the fear and the silence to find our way to the honest, beautiful quiet on the other side. And in that quiet, we began to build our home, not with bricks and mortar, but with shared blankets and intertwined fingers, and the simple, breathtaking peace of knowing we were finally, truly seen.